Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, CEO of Boardroom Resources, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. We're going to be doing a little bit of crystal ball looking today, and with me as a guest that's perfect to have this experience with me. Let me introduce David Chun, who's the CEO of Equilar. Equilar being one of the industry leaders in providing executive compensation data and governance software. So David, I picked you to do this with me because you've got a lot of years in this business. You've interacted with thousands of boards, so you're the perfect candidate. And because it's you, the first thing in my crystal ball that I'm going to look at is executive compensation. Now, obviously, this has been a focus for the last 10 years. The say on pay changed behavior, but we didn't see huge impact to that. But that hasn't waned the interest in compensation at all. In fact, a report came out, we saw a CEO make over $150 million, 1 year. That always raises the hair on the back of a lot of people's necks. So when you look in your crystal ball and look at executive compensation, what do you see in the years ahead?
Sure. First of all, TK, thank you again for the opportunity to be on the show. Love the new setup here in Times Square, so appreciate the opportunity to be here. But yeah, no, I mean, as you pointed out, it's actually, we just celebrated our 15-year anniversary. So we've been looking at pay trends, and ironically, we first got started in the fall of 2001 as Enron and Anderson were, in the process of going out of business. But as you pointed out, yes, SAM pay was adopted about 4 or 5 years ago. The results, if you look at the SAM pay voting, what majority of companies are getting over 90% of support from their investors. But thing to keep in mind, I mean, we've had over the last 5 or 6 years, going back to the end of the financial crisis, we've had a very benign environment where you've had artificial stimulus, interest rates being really low. And so the pay for performance equation, performance has been very good. You had the stock price market, the markets performed extremely well. So as a result, there hasn't been as much focus on the pay numbers themselves because by and large the companies are performing well. Now, as the Fed begins to raise interest rates, we'll see what ends up happening with the market, and if the performance doesn't necessarily match what we've seen in the past, I think you will definitely see much greater focus around the actual pay numbers themselves. The media loves to write about the CEO of Discovery Communications, David Zaslav, I think it was $180 million package, give or take at that point, right? But the key thing to keep in mind is that the performance has been very strong, and that's just across the generally across the board. But that being said, we'll see what happens as the economic environment changes.
Yeah. Do you see anything bubbling up on the gap that's occurring between the CEO and what they call the average worker pay?
Yeah.
The ratio. I think we've all agreed that we think that that's really a mistake, and it's going to be misread. But the gap is occurring, and as that gets wider, it brings attention. It's not only in society, but it's certainly true in business. So when you're looking again into your crystal ball, do you think that what might happen relative to that, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of issues around that. I think the latest update was the SEC is going to push that decision out even further on that. That's a number that, why it was created, the SEC exists to protect the investor. And at the end of the day, you talk to any major asset manager who's a major shareholder in a company, and they agree that information isn't necessarily going to help them. That being said, that information is going to be out there, and there's going to be unintended consequences of how that information is going to be used. The data certainly shows, if you look at the average pay of, the average worker, the increase in pay versus the annual increase in pay of a CEO, the CEO's pay is growing at a faster rate. There's no, the data supports that. That being said, it's a competitive labor market, and these CEOs, they are being, the reason you see a lot of these larger pay packages that have occurred in the last couple of years is because of the retention of key individuals. And for example, when the Microsoft CEO search was going on, what Qualcomm did to keep Mollenkopf and some of these other CEOs that were potential candidates. So at the end of the day, the reality is it is a competitive labor market, and what we're talking about, the CEO pay ratio of the average worker, that's the symptom and not the cause.
Yeah.
What you have here, you have a skills gap that you need to be able to, train the average worker to be able to meet the needs of the new economy. And so, I operate in Silicon Valley, and the competition for talent out there is just incredibly intense. And we're looking for skills, people with technical skills and whatnot. And that's really what we should be focusing on, and less so the ratio of the average worker versus the CEO.
Yeah, the ratio to me makes no sense.
Yep.
I think it's going to get all convoluted in that. But the concept of the gap,
Yeah.
sort of the we-they thing, is something that ultimately worries me, not only about business but also in society.
Yeah.
So let me get out of comp for a minute and look at my crystal ball again. And the next thing I see for the future is I see a very interesting challenge around board composition, board recruitment. We're seeing skills for cyber risk. People are looking for specialists,
Sure.
if you will. Although Bill Chandler and I had talked about some of the risks of being a specialist on the board.
Yep.
We've looked at board evaluations, how if you can do away with mandatory retirement, you can do away with term limits if you have great board evaluations. That's going to change the compositions, change the leadership, because it's going to require people to be good board leaders.
Sure.
But when you look at that whole mix, you guys have started to do a lot of very interesting work around this space. What do you see in the way of recruitment and composition?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I actually ironically just came from an event that Stanford was hosting for their institutional investor forum, and two of those items you talked about, cyber risk and board composition refreshment, were on the agenda. You've seen, since, probably over the last 6 to 9 months, and I think what really was the gasoline that was poured on the fire was Whole Foods with how they handled the Proxy Access shareholder proposal. And, this New York City pension fund, they've filed 75 shareholder proposals around this. The scrutiny of individual board members, not just the boards themselves, but the individual board members, I think is at an all-time high and will only get larger. And there's a tremendous thirst for knowledge and data around particular board members, why boards were constructed a certain way, the refreshment, how recently has new thought been brought into the boardroom. And based on what we had seen, over the last 6 to 9 months, we're actually in the process of launching a product called Board Edge, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to come back and talk more about that with some of the data will be coming out of that. But it's exactly to help companies to be able to assess, well, how does our board look relative to our peers? Maybe in a particular industry, you will have more tenured board members, or the median age will be higher versus others. And so this will be data to help boards to be able to objectively say, well, look, here's how our board matches up relative to our peer or peers within our industry or geography.
Well, I just think it's going to be very interesting when you throw Proxy Access on top of that, where you aren't planning who you're getting.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And then you even expand that further in universal ballot,
Yep.
where it could be all mixed
Yep.
up. That is really going to be an issue that investors have to think through.
Yep.
Because while it might be nice to put somebody on the board,
Yep.
if that sort of throws off the committee leaderships and the things that are so critical in today's world, I'm not sure that ends up being great things. So
yeah, long-term wise, yes, because you also have, we didn't even talk about the activists, the successes that they've had, even though technically, DuPont won in that particular situation, but you saw what happened at Darden and others, and so the activists are having a much higher hit rate in affecting change. And while you may get the short-term results, long-term, what will this mean for boardrooms?
Well, I've taken 2 looks into my crystal ball.
Yeah.
I want you to take a look. What thing pops up when you're sort of looking into the future?
Yeah, no. So recently, you saw the case about Citrix, and where the board was, lost their case in the Delaware court, specifically around director comp. And one of the big issues around that was peer group selection. And I think that's going to be a much, based on my conversation with other attorneys and whatnot, seeing all the memos that are being written by the law firms and others, is greater scrutiny around director comp, but also with the new pay for performance guidelines, when you're going to be able to benchmark, when you need to benchmark your pay and your performance, really comes down to your peer group. So I think what you're going to see over the next, in the second half of this year, is much greater scrutiny. How did we come up with our peers? Specifically in the Citrix case, they identified, the plaintiffs had identified, 4 or 5 other companies that were much larger than Citrix, and the Delaware courts agreed and said, well, geez, this just doesn't make sense. So I think the combination of director comp, the new pay for performance guidelines, a lot of interest around peer groups.
There seems to be, in that space, with peer groups, there seems to be a disconnect too. What the companies come up with, what the proxy advisors come up with, whatever. And that in itself causes a lot of consternation, I think, in the way of peer groups. What do you see, that's going to be a huge issue.
Yeah.
I mean, so what do you see that, I know you guys have always done a lot in peer group, but what do you see to try and bring some sanity to the way people
Well, I
think
mean, that's specifically around our algorithm that we had developed, our Equilar market peers, where we are taking the market data of everybody's disclosed peer group and look at the peers and the peers of peers and be able to map everybody out. So you mentioned about the consternation with the proxy advisors. In full disclosure, as you know, we are partners with Glass Lewis, and Glass Lewis relies their peer group selection. They use our peer group methodology, so they use the Equilar market peers. ISS, on the other hand, uses a GICS-based model, which frankly leads to more questioning on how some of this came up together. So our conversations with both board members and with people in the institutional investor community like the way we've approached how we drive the peer groups, because it's completely algorithmically driven. There is no judgment. We are, whether you say we're validating or invalidating how companies, somebody may choose a particular peer, but if, you hear this concept of aspirational peers, right? Well, that's okay as long as the data, the market data supports that, and our algorithm would either support or show that may not necessarily be the case on that front. So.
Well, David, I want to thank you again. You're one of the people that I would call on to help me with my crystal ball show, and I think I certainly appreciate you taking the time and coming to join us. And that will conclude this issue of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We will be back again next week, taking a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors, Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.